These two knives look similar. However, one is a chef's knife and the other is a butcher's knife. A butcher's knife has an angle here on the blade, whereas a chef's knife comes pretty much straight down. Also, in this too, it's subtle, but on a butcher's knife, you'll find this angle, this curve here on the back of the blade, whereas a chef's knife is a little bit longer and more straight. We want to be using the chef's knife. Now, there's one thing before we pick up a knife, we want to know where our hand is supposed to go. We want to be as strategic as possible. In order to properly use a knife, you want to make sure it has a tang that runs down the end through the full handle. That means you have a really good knife. In order to use them, you're going to want to wrap your hands around here between where these normal rivets are. My chef's knife doesn't have them. Most of your fingers are going to go there. Your thumb is going to go on this rivet here, and this finger is not going to go here. It's not going to go here. It's actually going to lay here. This gives you optimal control over the blade. But this is a butcher's knife, and I don't want that. So here we are, hand on, finger on, thumb on. That's how we want to be holding our knife. Thumb on where that rivet would be, finger down the side of the blade, and the rest of the fingers giving us control over it. There we go. That's how you properly hold a knife. To prep your garlic, you're going to want to take it and make sure you've washed it first. Cutting garlic on a cutting board is probably the last thing you want to do on that cutting board, because otherwise it's going to make everything you cut afterward taste like garlic. A good way to prep your garlic, because garlic has this skin on it that's difficult to get off. A good way to prep your garlic is to actually press it flat with your chef's knife. That cracks the garlic open so it's easy to peel. Trim off the end, and then simply peel off the outside of the garlic. I'm going to go ahead and do that to all of my garlic here. Now that my garlic is all peeled, I'm going to want to cut my garlic. Again, nice handhold on my knife. Now, this recipe calls for minced garlic. In order to mince garlic, we're going to use a rocking motion on the knife. Okay? So we're going to leave the knife in contact with the cutting board. That prevents us from cutting ourselves as easily. And we're going to go up and down. Now, you put your hand in a claw and push the garlic, hold the garlic in place and cut it. Now, as you get close to your fingers, you'll notice, because my fingers are in a claw formation, the knife hit my fingers on the side before it actually was able to cut me. It's a good way to avoid cuts. Go at the speed you're comfortable with. And you don't have to make exactly even cuts, because we're going to go back through this. So now that I've gone one way through my garlic, I'm going to scrape it all together. I'm going to put my hand up here, and I'm going to go through in another direction. And I'm just walking my way through the garlic. I'm going to scrape it together again. And walk my way through the garlic one more time. Scrape it together. And walk my way through the garlic. Then I'm going to remove any excess garlic from my knife. Scrape it up into a pile and decide whether or not that looks good. Now it does, so I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it back into my bowl. Always have the bowl that you're going to put it in on hand. A good way to do this is to put the cutting block off the edge of your counter and just scrape everything into it. There we go. My garlic is done. Now it's time to mix up our spices. If you have them, a combined set of tablespoons is a really, really good way to be able to mix your spices the way you would like them to be. If you don't have tablespoons, a combined set, you can also work with individual spoons, or you can just eyeball this recipe. So in this recipe, we're going to need a total of, it originally calls for 1.5 tablespoons of smoked paprika. Now, you can use smoked paprika if you have it, but I actually last time used this wonderful ancho chili powder. So I'm going to actually use more of this stuff. I'm going to cut the amount down a little bit though, just because I don't think I want anything quite so spicy this time around. One of the differences between baking and other kinds of cooking is that the spices can be adjusted very easily in most cooking. So I'm gonna just put in 1 tablespoon instead of a full tablespoon and a half of my ancho chili, and then I'm gonna put in the 2 teaspoons of cumin that this calls for. Now, because we're making 2 different things, we're going to be a little bit more strategic here, and we're going to put in our 2 teaspoons of cumin, but then I'm going to also want to use this for my crescent rolls that I'm making. So I'm going to put in my 2 teaspoons of cumin in here right now, and then I'm also going to put what's left of my cumin in this second bowl over here. I'm going to add a little bit of my chili powder to that as well. I don't want my rolls particularly spicy, so I'm going to call that good there. The other thing this recipe calls for is 2 teaspoons of red pepper flakes. Now again, I don't want to make this too terribly spicy, so I'm going to cut that down, and I'm going to call it maybe half of a teaspoon of red pepper flakes. Throw that in, because we can, and maybe a little bit more. I'm not going to add any of this to my, actually, I'll throw a little bit in for my bread as well. Now, it's a good idea when you're cooking to not only have all of your ingredients out when you start, but put them away as you go. Now, my cumin's empty, so I'm going to immediately throw that back in the trash. My other 3 ingredients are going to go back in the cupboard. The final thing that's going to get mixed in here with our spices before we add some oil is a little bit of salt. Now, our bread is going to have salt in it already, so we don't really need to add any salt to that, but we're going to want to add a fair amount of salt to this. The recipe calls for 2.5 teaspoons of salt, some of which goes directly into this, and some of which goes onto the chicken. So we're just going to put in a grind of salt. The wonderful thing about salt is if you don't put in enough at the beginning, you can always add more later. But you do want some, because that's going to allow the spice blend to penetrate into the chicken. So let's go ahead and do that. The last thing that we have to do is add a little bit of oil. The recipe calls for half a cup of oil. Now, I have this wonderful bottle, so I'm just going to pour my oil in until I feel like I've got enough. If I wanted to, I would measure it. If I feel like testing to make sure that it's the right amount, I can pull out a measuring cup and look and say, yep, that's about right. Now I need to whisk my oil together. I can do that either with an actual whisk, or I can do that with a fork. Whisking action is a circular action that actually hits the side of the bottle, hits the side of the bowl and bounces back up around. It's done from the wrist, not from the arm. Doesn't have to be perfect in this case. That's good enough. Now let's go ahead and shake that just to combine those ingredients. And we're going to set those aside. This is what's going to go on our chicken and on our garbanzo beans and our tomatoes. Now, because this is strategic cuisine, we're going to have to demonstrate the variable powers. So we're going to make a second batch of chicken using some fresh basil, some garlic powder this time, some more salt, some onion powder, and dill. This is going to give us a more Greek feel to our dish. So we are again going to take our trusty teaspoon and get some garlic powder, maybe a little bit more. We're going to get some fresh or ground, either way, dill. Throw that in there. We're going to get our onion powder. Throw that just a little bit into our mixture. And we're going to throw some oregano. We'll just put in, ooh, it was probably more oregano than we needed, but that's okay. And then we're going to throw in the basil. Now this basil is fresh basil, so we're just going to chop it up. We could also use ground basil or dried basil, either way. Using that same cutting method we used for the garlic earlier. We're going to take all of this and pour it into our bowl. There we go. Now we just need to add our oil and stir. So we're going to combine our 2 cans of garbanzo beans and our tomatoes into the same container, but we need to wash them all off. So let's save a little bit of time by taking our colander, pouring our tomatoes in, opening our garbanzo beans, pouring them in, rinsing them all off at the same time, and then pouring them into another bowl. So here we go. Here go the tomatoes. Nice, lovely batch of tomatoes. Then we're going to need to open the garbanzo beans. Now, before you pour this into the colander, make sure that you have your colander over either another bowl or that you have it over the sink, ideally. My garbanzo beans and my tomatoes. Now, the last thing I'm going to have to do to these is I'm going to have to pour some of that oil on them, but first, I need to get the chicken ready. So the last thing that we need for this recipe is we need some chicken. Now, whenever you're dealing with chicken, there's some things you want to remember. You always want to make sure that it has been in the refrigerator no longer than a few days. Because if it's longer than 3 days, that chicken's probably not good anymore. So always make sure you have fresh chicken. Second thing is don't cut it on a wooden cutting board. Use a plastic cutting board. So if you're only cutting one set of things, you can just use a plastic cutting board for the whole process. Also, try and do your chicken after you've cut anything that needs a clean surface, because you want to wipe down your kitchen after you're done, not in the middle of when you're cooking and then after you're done again. So we're going to open this up. We're going to have to pound this chicken flat to about a 1/2 inch thickness. So I have the tray that I'm going to do my cooking in, and I have a mallet. If you don't have a meat tenderizer or a kitchen mallet, you can use other things, such as a rolling pin, or If you prefer not to use the car method, you're going to want to take your chicken and open it up. And then just go ahead and dump it into your pan. Make sure to get rid of the container that it was in. Grab your kitchen mallet, and we're going to pound. You want to pound the chicken so it's about a 1/2 inch thick. We're just going to go ahead and pound this down. It doesn't have to be exact. Now, if you're using a tenderizer, the other thing this does is it's going to break some of the muscle fibers apart, because meat is actually muscle, and it's going to make it easier. It's going to make the meat softer, and it's going to make it easier for our spices and our oil to penetrate into the chicken. And there we go. That looks good. Doesn't take a lot. Doesn't take a lot. So last thing we're going to want to do with our chicken, and then we're basically done with our recipe, is we're going to want to combine all of the flavors here. So we're going to want to take some of our mixture that we have, of our spice mixture that we made up, and we're going to rub it onto our chicken. Now, we could do this with our hands or various other methods. You could use a spoon and put it and spoon it onto the chicken. Make sure you stir it up. Make sure you got all the good stuff that's in here. And you're going to literally just spoon it onto your chicken. Chicken is halfway done. And the last thing we want to do is we want to flip this over. And spoon it onto the other side of the chicken as well. Traditional method is to rub it in with your hands, but that's going to make your hands kind of gunky. So I would say don't even bother. Okay, we have one last thing that we need to do before we can get started with our cooking on this. We need to add the rest of our spices to our garbanzo beans. So we're just going to take the remaining oil and salt and everything and just pour it straight onto our garbanzo bean mixture. I'm going to move the chicken out of my way so we can see that. Scrape all of the remaining spices out of here. And stir this up. We do want to make sure this is good and mixed. Looks good. All right. Very last thing. Take our chicken, take our garbanzos, and combine. Now you might want to scrape some of the oil out of this. Mix it, spread it over your chicken so it's nice and well distributed. Doesn't have to be fully covering. There you go. This is, at this moment, ready to go in the oven. Now, I would always, as a general rule, add a little bit something extra. So I'm going to add a little bit of cracked black pepper, add a little bit of additional salt. There we go. This is ready to go in the oven. The last thing we need to do is to cook our crescent rolls. So, most crescent roll packages will have somewhere that says open here. Sometimes they're pop them on the counter, but this one is a peel. So, we're going to start here and we're going to peel it open. Be prepared for the pop. There we go. Let's go ahead and open your crescent rolls. Now this is by far the messiest part of this dish that we're going to make. So you notice it's all rolled up. So find the point where it is rolled up at and separate the roll. Should be on an angle. There it is. All right. Go ahead and roll it out. You might want to do this on a cutting board, but you can also do it straight on your pan. Mine are going to roll out in a couple of different sets. You could do the same thing with other kinds of dough as well. Now, normally we would simply roll from the wide end to the pointed end of the triangle. We don't want to do that in this case because we want first to put some of our spices on. Now, we have two options. We can either just sprinkle the spices on like that, and then take a simple case knife cut it and roll it. And then curve them to look like a nice little boomerang. It's a war boomerang. Now, that's one way of doing this. The other way of doing this is that you can brush these with a little bit of butter or brush them with a little bit of oil. You could also add oil directly to your thing and then use a pastry brush to brush it on. Either way works. I'm going to sprinkle this a little bit on here. I'm just going to continue down my entire set. You can also brush the outsides with a little bit of oil. And do that as well. These cook faster than your main entree is going to. So make sure that your main dish is already in the oven. And make sure you put your oil in the right spot when if you put oil on these. All right, so my chicken is out of the oven, as is my bread. And when you do pull them out of the oven, always check to make sure that they are fully cooked. So you can do that with either a meat thermometer, make sure the internal temperature exceeds 160, or you can just check it with a fork and a knife. If you're going to check it with a fork and a knife, just make a nice slice kind of somewhere through the middle and verify that it's not pink in the center and that the juices come out clear. This looks really good. It's ready to eat. So as you can see, I have two totally different versions of the exact same dish right here. We have the Middle Eastern and Indian version and the Greek version over here. They're going to taste exactly the same, but the ingredients are 99% identical. So here we have it. Variable player powers manifested in cooking. I'm going to plate this up and we can go ahead and get back to our game. So I think I may go ahead and play a game of Pandemic. So hope you enjoy this. Have a good time and have some strategic cuisine.